Hey there, and welcome. I'm Anna Hartman, and this is Unreal Results, a podcast where I help you get better outcomes and gain the confidence that you can help anyone, even the most complex cases. Join me as I teach about the influence of the visceral organs in the nervous system on movement, pain, and injuries, all while shifting the paradigm of what whole body assessment and treatment really looks like. I'm glad you're here. Let's dive in. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Unreal Results podcast. I am your host, Anna Hartman. So I've been talking about this topic for a while now. It's been on my list of things I wanted to talk about, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But I think too, sometimes I avoid it because it just comes with a lot of like emotion and feelings, and then sometimes you're just not ready for that kind of thing. So but here we are. It's definitely something that needs to be talked about, and that is grief. To give you a little background in case you're new here, I had a 10-year span of a lot of grief, a lot of big losses, all within a short period of time. So it started in, I think it was like March 2009. One of my athletes that I was fairly close with, we just had, we were friends. We had all I can describe is, when you meet people and you're just like, feel like you've known them forever and you're instantly best friends. And even if you aren't necessarily around them a lot, you just feel this deeper connection with them. That is probably the best way I can describe this athlete to you. He was a football player. I met him back in 2004, so really early on in my career. And we just had a connection. I didn't see him very often, and I, only in the off season when you come in to athletes performance and train with us, but we just seemed to have a special bond. And so in March of 2009, he died in a tragic accident. He was fishing with a group of friends in the Gulf of Mexico, and his boat capsized, and he was never found. And him and another one of the guys in the boat, so I think there was 3 people in the boat, and only one of them survived and was found. So the other 2 men were lost, and bodies were never recovered. And that was a very tragic death, and it was very surprising to me of how affected I was by it. I don't think I realized until his death, like, that we did have that connection, and I was just very affected by it. I mean, obviously I'm still tearing up. So that was the first thing. And then also in 2009, I had back surgery, which was a really big deal. And in general, if anybody's had any back pain, there's like a huge amount of grief that comes with that, and sadness and sorrow and feeling of loss, and especially needing to have emergency surgery. And I lost dorsiflexion, and I was like worried that I'd never be the same again. And so that came with its own set of stress and grief. And then 2, there's a little bit of, when you're a rehab professional, there's a bit of feelings around being injured, especially in a injury like disc herniation, an injury like back surgery, is because, you're supposed to be the expert in knowing how to prevent those things from happening. And so there was a big identity loss, I think, around that as well, that I felt. But again, I don't think at the time I realized that this was a big grief in my life. but I knew that it was a big stressor in my life. So that was, so like I said, March was the first thing, and then this was July. And then in 2010, 2010, the real estate market had crashed, and the condo that I had bought in 2006 was completely underwater. I bought the condo for like $160,000 or $170,000, and I ended up foreclosing on it in October of 2010, and it went to auction for $29,000. So I was about 130 grand underwater. And luckily, I lived in a state. I lived in Arizona where I didn't have a whole lot of liability for that loss, besides a ding on my credit and from not paying the mortgage payments. But still, again, it was a big sense of loss and a big thing that I was like ashamed about, and just another big stressor. The exact day I foreclosed on the house, my grandma passed away. I didn't expect to cry about that, but my grandma passed away and I didn't get to see her, which I regretted. I still regret not going home sooner to see her to say goodbye. I was actually on my way to see her to say goodbye. I was flying from Phoenix to Eureka, California, which is not the easiest town to get to. So I had a layover in San Francisco, and when I landed, for my layover, my mom called me and let me know that she had just passed away. So I missed saying goodbye to her. My grandmother and I were very close. She wrote me a letter every week of college. So I think that's why a lot of regret and grief around her loss. Sheesh. So that was on October 2010, and October 7th to be exact. So then in 2011, March of 2011, my sister was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And in April of 2011, she had a 22-hour brain surgery to remove said tumor, which was a meningioma. Sorry. And that was scary. And she's still here with us, thankfully, but it just added to the sadness and stress of things. And also, too, there was a loss of kind of like life as we knew it before. She, overall, in the scheme of how bad it could be after surgery, she's very good. She ended up getting seizures from the surgery, and, no one would realize the effect of her brain surgery on her, except for probably me and her and my mom, when my mom was alive. But, she's has challenges, sort of processing multiple things at once and like being resilient to stress. So there is a effect and a huge loss from that brain surgery, because it's not she's a different person, but she's changed. And whenever there's a significant change like that it comes with feelings of loss, feelings of grief and sorrow. And we didn't even really have a whole lot of time even to process that, because in August, So just 4 months later, my mom was diagnosed with stage 3B lung cancer and started her journey in battling lung cancer, which lasted for 2 years. And it was a constant, I'd say that 2 years was a constant feeling of grief, because lung cancer is one of those cancers that when it's caught late like that is pretty much a death sentence. So we knew that her days were numbered, which is the silver lining of it, because it gave us the opportunity to spend as much time as possible with her. But it also meant that you were grieving the loss of her before she was even gone. During this same time, my stepdad, Grady, was also going through the beginnings of dementia. And that comes with a whole set of grief too, as you watch somebody slip away in front of you and becoming a different person. And he decided not to follow my mom to Sacramento for treatment because it was hard for him, having dementia. It was hard for him to create such change in his life, like living in a new place, and also it was hard for him to deal with my mom dying. So they basically got separated at that time, and so that was another huge grief on top of it all. So throughout those 2 years, was tough, up and down, a lot of sadness. And again, like, as you can see, it started, all this loss started, and it just started accumulating. And then my mom passed away in September of 2013. Probably 10 years coming up here. And that felt like the toughest. It was probably the toughest thing I went through and the biggest loss, losing her. And everything that comes along with not just losing a loved one, but when you lose a parent, there's a loss of identity of there's just a loss of identity, a loss of home, a loss of being the daughter, a loss of having a parent, right? So that was another piece. I'm only laughing because I don't know why obviously I knew I was going to cry during recording this episode, because that's why I've been avoiding it. So I was losing my mom in 2013. Then we lost my stepdad in 2015. We just had, piling it on at that point. And then things felt a little bit more stable. Well, but then also, like, when you think about it, I also lost a good high school friend in 2013. And my good friends in Arizona, their mom also lost her battle with cancer in 2013. So there's a lot of loss in that sense. And then my dad passed away in 2019. So here we are, 2023. And I'd say I've done so much work, if that's what you want to call it, around feeling my feelings and grief, and learning about grief, and learning how to take care of myself. That's really been the journey. That journey started with my mom. After my mom passed away, like, I just realized I didn't want to be in her same situation. She took care of us her whole life, took care of others. She finally had retired. And was ready to enjoy her retirement. And like 2 weeks after she retired, she got diagnosed with lung cancer. And I was just like, fuck, Like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be endlessly taking care of other people and never have the opportunity to enjoy life and take care of myself. And I was reflecting on it, and I hadn't really like taken a vacation that wasn't associated with a work trip ever. Even in college, like I'd work on this in the summertime. And so I finally was like, after she passed away, I knew I needed a break. I thought I was actually burnt out on taking care of people at work. So I started the process of transitioning roles at Athletes Performance, now Exos, from the director of physical therapy to working on the performance innovation team, which was doing a lot of like online education for some of our programming and new employees coming in with all the different contracts that we had. And because I really didn't think I wanted to do patient care anymore, I was so burnt out. And that was when, actually, in that transition time, the manager or president of Athletes Performance at the time, he asked me, he said, hey, as we transition your roles here during our combine season, which is like basically January through March, the end of March, when the NFL athletes are training, well, the soon-to-be NFL athletes are training for the NFL Combine, and then the Major League Baseball players are doing spring training prep. He basically asked me to still do clinical work for those 3 months to help out because there's so many people at that time. And I was like, yeah, sure. And so the first time in like 7 or 8 years that my only responsibility at work was actually working with clients, working with athletes. And in those 3 months, I felt a lot of my joy come back at work. And I realized that, oh my gosh, like this is what I'm really good at. And I still love to do it. And it's not that I don't want to take care of people anymore. It's like, I realize that I need the time and space to not have other things stressing me out in a way that can be my only focus, and including I need to take some time away from work altogether and take care of myself, because I realized I was on the same path as my mom. I was constantly putting work and everyone at work and everything at work in front of taking care of myself. And so I quit. I quit for that reason, 100%, was to take care of myself and to return to full patient care mode. And I knew I couldn't do it at that job. Once I was already the director, it's hard to go backwards in the company, right? Any company. And so that's when I decided to start my own business and also take some time off. I basically was telling people that I was taking time off to take care of myself and enjoy my mom's retirement. Obviously, when my mom passed away, my sister and I inherited money and got life insurance from her. And so for the first time too, I didn't really have to worry about making ends meet. And I had money to support me in just living. And so I took vacations, and that really started the deep dive into processing my feelings and doing personal development around taking care of myself, around feeling my feelings. Up until that point, I was like major stuffer. I would just ignore it. I would just stuff my emotions. And so I started, journaling, and I did a yoga teacher training, which was so helpful. And I started reading some books. And throughout the years, actually, it took me, this is not, I took 8 months off from work before I started working again, but it's not like in 8 months I processed everything, right? The grieving process lasts forever. As you can see, I still get emotional. I still start crying when I think about all the loss. But But now I'm more okay with it. And I think that's just sort of one of the big messages. And this is one of my athletes recently. His father passed away, and that was my advice to him. And that's sort of my wisdom to him was, listen, you're going to be sad about it. You're going to have a lot of sorrow and sadness and grief. And it's going to last forever. There's not a timeline on it, and it's not something that feels really big now and doesn't feel really big in 2 months. It fluctuates. Sometimes it really feels really big years later, and sometimes it doesn't. And also that when you're feeling a certain way, sad or lonely or whatever it may be, or angry, like that is not you, that you are separate from your feelings. Your feelings are energy moving throughout the body, moving throughout the mind, and it's not who you are. Because I felt sad for a really long time. I'd say nowadays, I still feel sad often, but it doesn't linger. And it's also a feeling that I think people try to run away from, but it's just part of the experience. Part of loving someone so much. It's part of like feeling, like it's hard to feel really happy without feeling some sadness. And I used to just stuff it and ignore it. And now when it happens, I name it. Like, I'm like, man, I'm sad today. Or I'm feeling sad today. Or, you can put the word feeling, that's fine. But it's recognizing that when you feel sad, it's a feeling and it's not who you are. You are not sad forever. And I think at the beginning, right after losing my mom, and I was just so sad through the 2 years of her battle with cancer, that I just felt like this is me forever. Like I felt like I had lost myself a little bit, and it took a long time of learning how to take care of myself and processing my feelings and giving me the space to feel these things and realizing that I was not my feelings, that I finally found myself again. And it's funny because I realized, like, when I felt that for the first time, I was at a friend's house, like a friend's party, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is the first time I felt myself, like Fun Anna is back. And so then for a while, I still sometimes refer to that as Fun Anna. But at the same time, like, there was not a Fun Anna and a Sad Anna. It's all parts of me, right? So, and I realize that now, like, I can really be really fun and silly and happy. And then I can also be really sad. And it's okay to have both. And, I think sometimes too, like I recently posted this thing on Threads, I think. But basically it was like, let's normalize really actually answering your friends when they ask how you're doing, instead of being like, oh, I'm fine. Like, give an honest answer. And man, is it disarming for people. But I really try to, in those moments when somebody asks me how I am, like I try to actually be like, damn, like how am I doing? Because the tendency to ignore and stuff is always there, because who wants to feel sad? Not me, right? But realizing that it's there is like half the battle of like not feeling it anymore. It's just, sometimes I think about them, it's like, like a little kid, like sometimes they're just like so annoying and like talking all the time. And it's like part of the reason I think they talk all the time is because they just want to be heard. And us adults sometimes ignore them just to let them talk, and it gets so frustrating. And it's like, if you just take a second and like look at them and be like, yeah, interesting. What are you thinking? Engage in a conversation with them, then they're less annoying. They stop talking as much because they just wanted to be heard. And the feelings are often like that too. So, where am I going with this besides just having this like cry fest on the internet? That's not me. That's not the goal. I wanted to share a couple other things about grief. One, the visceral effects and the body effects of grief are huge. So grief is most associated with the lungs, the organ of the lungs. And so oftentimes we can get a lot of referred pain to the mid-back, neck, and shoulders from grief. So I will often see this a lot. Someone will come to me with shoulder pain, or back pain, or just even any, you can have hip tightness from that tension up in the upper thorax, right? Because it's going to change everything in our diaphragm and how our body functions. And when you do a good history, one, the LTAP, the locator test assessment protocol, takes me to their lungs. And then also realizing oftentimes people are dealing with some grief and sorrow. And this can be in the lungs. So that is a very normal occurrence to have shoulder, neck, and upper back pain while dealing with losses. Now, also, some of the feelings that come with grief is anger and fear, especially so in the example of my mom passing away from cancer, there is a big fear that I'll get cancer, or my sis will get cancer, or anything that goes on in our bodies. We're like, oh my God, it's cancer, right? Like you start to be kind of a worrier and you're afraid of getting sick. The mortality that we are faced with becomes very apparent when you lose a parent that is young, like I did. So my mom was only 61, I believe, when she passed away. Not even. She would have been 61 that year. So 60. And so there's a big component of that. Fear and anger, those emotions usually get discharged or affect the liver quite a bit. The liver, again, commonly refers pain to the right shoulder and neck, as well as the back. As well as left-sided sciatica is a pretty common one too. So again, all of those symptoms can be associated with grief and loss. And then the spleen actually is the organ that worry affects quite a bit. So the spleen, if we think about the spleen, you can get left shoulder pain with spleen stuff, as well as the spleen, the main organ of the lymphatic system. So along with the liver and the lungs, all of this can create a lot of lymphatic congestion. So that's interesting. I'm learning recently there's some mineral imbalances that can occur in our body because of these traumatic responses as well, which has been really interesting. I have what's called a calcium shell, which is seen a lot in trauma and high stress and those kind of feelings. So that's been really interesting to be working on that from a nutritional or mineral standpoint. And then, so it's like the message I want to share is grief can be really physical. We cannot feel well in our body because of these emotions that we are feeling or not allowing ourselves to feel very much, right? So, or at least not processing them. And then some of my other lessons I learned from grief, and I'm going to share some of the books that I think was really helpful and probably the top things that I did to take care of myself and help me through those times is the stages of grief that are most well known that were described by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Interesting enough, like I'm sure you've heard of them. It's like fear, anger, denial, bargaining, and acceptance are the stages of grief. Those get thrown around a lot. But what most people don't realize is that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually described those and wrote about those stages of grief in relationship to the patient that's dying, the person that is dying. Those are the stages that they go through when they find out they have a terminal illness and are going to die. It is not the same thing that you go through as someone who is grieving the loss of something or someone. That in itself is very mind-blowing, because oftentimes when you look to the stages of grief, you're like, I've not gone through all of these, and also feel like you have to go through all of them because we're trying to get this acceptance at the end, right? But again, realizing that that was described for someone who was dying, someone who had a terminal illness, is important to understand. You, as the person left behind in the loss, or even the loss of something else, right? I listed all those things, and one of the things I talked about is the loss of identity, a loss of my house that I had bought, a loss of feeling of home. Like the things you feel lost for doesn't have to be losing a loved one or losing someone to death. Loss can be a lot of different things. Recently in the last couple of years with my track athlete, we've, he got disqualified at the World Championships for a false start, and that felt like this huge loss. And what's interesting, now that I've gone through so much grief of losing people, losing loved ones to death, I much more recognize the feeling of loss, the feeling of sorrow from loss when it comes to other things. And so I'm like, gosh, like, man, going through this, losing in sport, losing in business, losing whatever, right? Losing money. That's another thing, like losing trust in someone. Oh my gosh, that's a huge thing. That's a story for another day. But I've lost a lot of money in trust from a situation with a loved one too. That is, again, like these feelings of loss and sorrow mixed with shame that I recognize better now because of the work I have done to recognize the feelings I had with the loss of my mom, the loss of my friend, the loss of my grandparent. So that's been a really interesting thing too, is realizing that there is a lot that goes through life, that we have go on in life, that we feel feelings of loss and grief and don't probably even recognize it because it's sort of like less accepted forms of grief. So that's interesting. With that said, what are the things that helped me? So I mentioned I did a yoga teacher training fairly soon after my mom passed away and I took time off. That was a really huge piece for me because of the emphasis on self-inquiry and taking care of yourself. The self-inquiry piece we did in my yoga teacher training was actually the work from Byron Katie. And so I'll link her stuff in the show notes. Basically, she has a series of 4 questions called The Work that helps you use self-inquiry on the things you believe. And oftentimes, what we are believing is not what is actually happening in reality. The best example I can give to you of this is after my mom died, I learned if I said she should be here, if I was upset and I was like, and wrapped up in these feelings of she should still be here, she should be able to see me in my business, she should be able to meet my nieces, she should be able to see me get married one day. If I am letting these stories of should run rampant, then I am believing something that is not true. Because the truth is she won't be here for those things, or she isn't here for these things because she died. It's sort of like saying she shouldn't have died. She did die. So that happened. And me saying she shouldn't have is arguing with reality. And when you argue with reality, that's when it doesn't feel good. That's when it has all this very powerful, charged energy that feels dissonant. Like there is a dissonance with it within you. And so learning that self-inquiry, learning the work by Byron Katie and applying her 4 questions to some beliefs really allowed me to live in reality even when reality sucks. When you're in reality, it just feels better because it's the truth. And that's the thing I talk about actually a lot within Movement Rev and learning how to listen to your patients and listen and trust your body is understanding what it feels like to be in truth in your body. And when you can recognize that, you recognize when you're not in truth in your body, when there is dissonance, and you can be like, what is a belief I am believing that is not true, that is creating this dissonance? And when you can identify it and find the truth, find the reality, then it completely discharges things. So that's been a huge thing. So Byron Katie is her name, and her method is called The Work. So the other thing is journaling, writing how I felt, giving myself space to unstuff stuff, as well as one of the biggest things was when I lost my mom, I talked to her every day. I always talked to her every day. My mom and I were very close my entire life. I realized that not everyone has that relationship with their parents, and that is fine. But for me, part of the feelings of loss when I lost my mom was also losing my best friend, because that is who I talked to about everything. And so I really miss those daily conversations. I still miss those daily conversations. And when I really feel like I want to talk to her, I write her a letter. On many Mother's Days and her birthdays after her death, I would still get a card for her and write it, and I would just place it inside the urn I have for her ashes. Or I just leave it in the journal, and I have all these letters to my mom. And also that I learned that in the yoga teacher training is like, we are all mirrors to each other. And so sometimes you can write a letter to someone like that you miss, or even that you're having a problem with, or a love letter. And if you go back through and read that letter and you replace their name with your name, those are the messages that you need to hear. Our deeper wisdom knows what we need, and sometimes we have a hard time admitting it to ourselves. Or when you write it down, even when you're referring to someone else or writing to someone else, and you read it back as if it were written to you, that is sometimes exactly what you needed to hear. And so, one, the act of still writing her and communicating to her, and then also realizing that some of the things I was saying to her, I needed to hear for myself, right? So like, even when I wrote like, Mom, I miss you so much. Like, I wish you were here. Here's what I need from you. When I read that back in my own name, Anna, I miss you so much. I wish you were here, and this is what I need from you. It was like, oh man, like how true is that? I felt like I had lost myself in that whole thing. And I was missing myself. And when I recognized that, I could do the things I needed to do to find myself again, including feeling the feels, writing them down, recognizing it, and then doing the things to make the space to make my nervous system feel better and know that I was loved and not alone and all the things that I listed out, right? So that was so eye-opening and so helpful. So that is one practice that I still do when I feel like I need to talk to my mom or my dad now that he's gone too. Pro tip, if you're listening to this and you haven't lost a parent or a loved one, save their voice messages, record them as much as you can. You will miss their voices. Just a side note there, because sometimes I will listen to them when I need to hear them too. So then along the years, I finally found a book that I think, man, I wish I would have had it right after I was going through all of this. But one of the books that really helped me was a book called Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. So my anxiety was like off the charts when my mom was going through her cancer journey, and then after she died. And I would say like I probably always had a level of anxiety. It was just like through the roof afterwards. I mean, this book was so helpful in realizing that it's a really common feeling for people to feel after losing someone and after experiencing grief and loss. And so, man, I cannot speak more highly about this book. Like, I think everyone should read it. It is by, I think if I didn't say it, her name is Claire Bidwell Smith. She also has an Instagram that I'll link in her. She's just a great resource. The book's a great resource and has some really practical things recommended in the book to help you process and deal with the feelings of sorrow. So another book that's good in that sense is called Option B by Sheryl Sandberg. So Sheryl Sandberg, if you don't know who that is, she was a Facebook executive. She lost her husband at a young age. She had young children. And so she wrote a book about like building the resilience in herself from loss. And there was some really great tips that she had about just learning how to like find gratitude and build gratitude, build your strength, build your resilience again with some daily habits of journaling and some other things too. So that's another book that I think is really great. And then the other books that I've often shared, the Byron Katie books, so I'll share a couple of those. And then some books about other people's losses. So Rachel Brathen, who's known as Yoga Girl on social media, she wrote a book about losing her best friend that was very helpful. And then also Corey Martinez, who was the yoga teacher that I took the yoga teacher training with, she wrote a book called Plus One, and it's about kind of life, but about a loss of due to a miscarriage, so losing a baby, as well as she talks about this concept of avidya, or like arguing with reality, in the book too. So those are great memoirs as well. The other one too that was really good in terms of dealing with it, which is from a different perspective, was the perspective of the person dying, was When Breath Becomes Air, from Paul Kalanithi. He had lung cancer and he was a doctor, and he wrote this book about his journey as well. So in addition to the books, that was really helpful. One of the things that was helpful too was Oprah and Deepak Chopra did a series of meditations and journal practices. And this is actually something that I did even during my mom's, when my mom was still alive, when she was going through her cancer treatments. And it was really helpful too. And then I actually went back through the ones that were my favorite and I felt like the most helpful after she passed away. I'll link them in the show notes. I'm thinking about too, during this journey, like, especially, I brought up the yoga teacher training and the self-inquiry work. The other thing that was really helpful with the yoga teacher training, and actually I think bridges the gap between the visceral piece and the journey, is I went to yoga maybe 2 days after my mom passed away, or 4 days. Like, it was very close after she passed away, and I didn't really want to do anything, but I just felt like I needed to do something to take care of myself. And Corey was teaching a class, and the space at Asha Yoga in Sacramento was just a space I really loved to be in. And I laid down in class, and the music playing was Garth Stevenson's music, which, if you've ever heard that, it just makes you feel in your body so much. And class started, and then I took a breath, and then I just burst into tears, and what it felt like is, I think it was 4 days, and what it had felt like is I felt like I was holding my breath, that I literally couldn't breathe since the moment my mom took her last breath. And being in yoga that day just was like a big exhale. It just allowed me to like start breathing again. And that is such a common thing to say when we actually, breath is associated with so much emotion, right? Because we use words like that a lot, like held my breath, it took my breath away. And we can say it took my breath away both from fear and being scared or sad, as well as like being blissful and happy. And just it's really interesting how we associate breath and the words regarding breath with so many things. But I really did feel in that moment like that it was the beginning of being able to breathe again, and beginning of being able to allow my breath to create some space for me and to create some healing for me. in the loss around my mom and just being able to take care of myself. And then about a month later, I actually took a 50-hour advanced yoga teacher training with Corey. Actually, and this was before my full 200-hour. And in the 50-hour training, the thing that was unexpected was the amount of healing I did in that 4-day. It was like a 4-day or 6-day like experience, and the amount of healing, and I think majority of it was actually from the kirtan work, which, if you're not familiar with Sanskrit words with yoga, kirtan is a call and response chanting or singing. And the group singing and the energy was just so healing. And if you break down singing and chanting, what it is just like a lot of extended exhale breaths, which is so calming to the nervous system, as well as singing and even talking, right? Even this podcast is like so therapeutic to get the words out, right? To talk and to verbalize is not only good to like call things out and put words on how you're feeling, but even in song and singing, chanting, doing wind instruments, the long exhale stimulates our autonomic nervous system to move into a parasympathetic mode. And that parasympathetic state is where the healing takes place. It's where our resilience and our recovery and our revitalization happens. And so that chanting, I leaned into the chanting a lot. And I took what I learned in that 50-hour and I would do the kirtan on my own, just to, it's like a pranayama breath practice in itself. So pranayama is the Sanskrit word for breathing exercises, basically an extension of your life force, your prana, extension, a pulling out of your life force. And doing the breath work was a huge important piece for me, I think. And at the time I didn't necessarily realize the power of it on the nervous system, but now I know that not only is it very stimulating to the vagus nerve, but the glossopharyngeal nerve and other nerves of social engagement, which are so important for that parasympathetic state and that feeling of safety. And especially too, you think about a kirtan is usually in a group scenario, like a group class is singing together, this call and response. And that in itself is such social engagement and community. And that is a big piece of healing that I think that we miss a lot, especially when it comes to grief and loss, because people have so much shame around the feelings of grief and loss and sadness. Like there's a lot of shame around the feeling of sadness. And so we don't talk about it. And since we don't talk about it or give it life, we don't put ourselves in opportunities to create community and have that social engagement, which is so important for the safety of our nervous system and the healing of our mind and body. So I did want to share that piece too, because I think it's important. And then it goes to like, what can you do from a movement standpoint to support this grief process, especially when there is a visceral connection to it. And it's movement to support the lungs. So supporting breathing exercises, doing self-massage, like with the quarters ball around the rib cage. Man, I wish I had the quarters ball as a tool early in my grief practice, using the quarters ball to compress and mobilize the liver and the visceral organs around the spleen, like the upper abdominal organs. All of this side bending, rotation, all of these exercises that can be so supportive to the lungs, to the liver, to the spleen, and to the nervous system itself is such a wonderful way to take care of your body when it's needing to discharge emotions in relationship to grief. So hopefully this was helpful for you. And I think too, I spoke to this a little bit when I talked about recognizing the feelings of loss when my athlete went through athletic loss, and like realizing that that's what the feeling I was feeling was happening. I think that I spent so many years stuffing my emotions, as it was hard for me to ever recognize what I was feeling. And in fact, the more work I do around feeling my feels, feeling everything, even exteroceptive information, the more I spend getting to know myself, getting to feel with my body as a feeling being, and getting in tune with my emotions, the better it is that I can recognize them when they rise up, and recognize when I have that dissonance, or recognize when I'm in resonance of truth or not arguing with reality. And it was actually too with that, I mentioned how my dad passed away in 2019, and I didn't talk a lot about it when I was giving you sort of the timeline of this 10-year chunk of grief. And the overwhelming feeling, of course I was sad when he passed away. I was very sad. But the overwhelming feeling actually was me realizing for the first time probably in my life, which at the time I was 39. So for 39 years, realizing that actually my entire relationship with my dad, since I was a child, since I was probably 3, that I was having feelings of sadness and grief throughout my life with him, because he wasn't a big part of my life. And so I was having these feelings of loss of a father while he was alive. And this is very similar. I talk about this in relationship to my stepdad having dementia, and then this is in my mom having cancer. Like, sometimes you're grieving the loss before the loss actually happens, or before you realize that the loss was there. So in this case, when my dad died, I was sad, but there was actually a huge feeling of relief. And when I really sat down with that, the relief was this feeling of like, oh my gosh, I've been grieving my whole life, really. And now I finally have a place for the grief, if that makes sense. Like, I finally had a reason for the grief. Like, he was truly all the way gone, if that makes sense. And I found relief in that moment, but it was also a moment that made so much sense to me, and I was proud of, because I don't know if I would have recognized it years before. And then, of course, too, I think all the work leading up to that was like the last of this big 10 years of grief. All the work leading up to my dad passing away, after from when really it was with my mom passing away that I started to actually learn how to deal with it. All of that work from 2013 into 2019, when my dad passed away, the 6 years of like doing the work and taking the time to take care of myself, really put me in a place where it was easier for me to be in my sadness, and name it, and be okay with it, and write letters, or like talk to my dad out loud, or listen to the voicemails, but then also recognize how it's just a different dynamic. But yeah, like, having the tools was, I think, so important. And so there was a whole different energy around losing him, and then losing my mom, then losing my grandma, who obviously, like, filming this podcast makes sense. I'm still so upset about it, because back when that happened, it was such a new experience to me. And then it was piled on with a bunch of other stuff. I never got the time to really like do the things to process it. So hopefully, I know this podcast kind of rambled on a little bit, but I hope that, one, you understand the story where I'm coming from. Not that I was trying to show you that I'm an expert in grief by any means, because I don't think that's true. But just to give you some context of like, it's been a lot. It was a deep pile of grief and sadness. And I've really, took the time to unpack a lot of it. And also, one of the things that I felt was most important during this process is sharing it with other people, and talking about death, and talking about grief, and talking about being sad, because I think that is part of the problem. People don't know how to act. don't know what to say. They don't like feeling uncomfortable, so they don't want to ask questions about things that they know that might upset you. And so I'm very open with how I feel. I'm very open with my grief process, my grieving process, the continued grieving process, because I want it to be a conversation that people have with each other, because we all, it is a very human experience to lose something, someone, have grief, have sorrow. And since we're all going to experience it and experience different amounts of it, it's helpful to share things like this. Hope you see the kind of the full body picture. And then also I hope that you have some resources to deal with grief as it comes up for yourself or your patients. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.